Okay, so I'm gonna introduce our speaker today. We're pretty fortunate to have Professor Meredith MacGregor, and she is she drove down so that she can spend some more time in our beautiful state, which is great to hear. Colorado is a little cooler, right? So I mean temperature wise, so it's like being on vacation in New Mexico. Where it's nice and warm still. Anyways, so Meredith has gotten both her BA and a PhD at Harvard University in Cambridge. And then you spent a couple of years at Carnegie as an NSF postdoctoral fellow. And then as of early 2020, just before the pandemic, she started her assistant professor position at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so as you'll see, she works a lot with ALMA data, primarily to investigate planet formation from at the very early stages. And so my fun fact for Meredith is that she also has a crazy cute Australian Shepherd dog, similar to mine. And so with that, if we need people online to be muted. Actually, I'm pretty sure that we need people online to be muted. All right, Francis will take care of it. So. Okay. We're gonna let that go. Okay, great. Is this? So talking. It's gonna be fun. Can you guys hear back there? Is this working at all? It's on. In theory, it's on. I think it's only working if it's like literally right here. Yeah. Fun. That's okay. Just put it here. We're just gonna put it here, and I'm gonna shout really loudly, and hopefully everybody can hear me. Good. No, it's fine. I think I can hear it. Yeah. Okay. Great. This is fun. It's like teaching. Get to teach in all sorts of crazy modes. So yeah, it's really fun to be here. I'm excited to share some of my work with you. This is my first like in-person colloquium in a year and a half, 2 years or something. So this is going to be fun. Yeah. So I work in planet formation and habitability. Before I get too far into the weeds of things, I wanted to. In theory, this is going to advance my slides. No, it's not. There we go. Now it's advancing my slides. Okay. So I wanted to introduce my research group because a lot of what I get to show today is exciting results that my students and postdocs have been working on. So our research group largely works in trying to study habitability, and we do that by looking at connections between things in planetary systems. So we're trying to understand how disks and stars and planets interact, and we use multi-wavelength observations to do that work. These are sort of three questions that as a group we're tackling right now. The first is trying to understand how disk structure relates to planetary dynamics. The second is trying to understand how stars and stellar activity influences planetary atmospheres and disk chemistry. And then we're also trying to look at compositional, so how volatiles are inherited from the star formation and planet formation process into potentially habitable atmospheres. And these are all of my students. Anna and Spencer are both undergrads. I have 2 new undergrads that just joined this semester. Kiana and Jay are both grad students who've been working with me, and Ward just started as a postdoc this fall. So I want to start with an overarching picture of planet formation so that we're all on the same page when I start talking about disks and planets. So we think, right, that planets form from these giant molecular clouds. Pieces of these clouds become overdense and they collapse. We form a pre-main sequence star, right? And that star is surrounded by a disk of material, dust and gas, what we call a protoplanetary disk. This is when there's enough material to form giant planets, right? And so we think that planets form within these disks. And then sometime after about 10 million years, very rough time scale, most of the material from the disk is cleared away, and we're left with a main sequence star, any planets that may have formed during this earlier phase, and then this remnant ring of debris, which is what we call a debris disk. So just to kind of draw that distinction a little bit clearer, right, on the left, these are our protoplanetary disks. So these are beautiful images taken by ALMA as part of the D-Sharp survey. So these are all pre-main sequence stars. They're very rich in primordial gas. So I like to think that these are the reservoirs of planet formation, right? This is the only stage in this evolution where we have enough material to form large planets. And on the right, these are our debris disks, right? So these are our evolved systems. They're all around main sequence stars. These are a variety of ALMA images. There may still be enough material at this point to form sort of smaller terrestrial-sized planets. And there is still gas in these systems, but the gas we think is actually coming from cometary collisions, right? So these are collisionally dominated systems where you can think of asteroids and comets, we call planetesimals, are smashing into each other, and they're grinding down into tiny dust grains that we can see with ALMA, and they're also outgassing things like CO. And so we can see some gas in these systems. So you can kind of think of debris disks as like the fossil record of planet formation, right? They're the stuff that's left over, you know, everything went into planets, and this is the same kind of leftover material. Okay, so I always like to start with a little bit of like a history lesson or perspective on the field, right? So the very first disks, circumstellar disks, were discovered back in the 1980s by the IRAS satellite. And all they were what we call infrared excess sources. So if you looked at what we call the spectral energy distribution, right, which is flux as a function of wavelength, the black here is showing what we think a stellar spectral energy distribution looks like. And what was noticed is that if you looked at these sources at infrared wavelengths, right, there was an excess of emission. They seemed too bright to be just a star by itself. And so that was interpreted as being dust, where you actually have dust surrounding these stars. The dust is getting heated up by the star, and then it's re-radiating that as thermal energy in the infrared and long-word radio wavelengths. So, you know, this is what the spectral energy distribution would look like for a typical disk source. We have the star, and then we have this peak up that's highlighted in blue here, where this dust is getting heated up. So we've come a long way now, and now we can actually resolve all of these infrared excess sources as these actual beautiful disks. So it's important to note that there's a difference in emission. When we look at short wavelengths, things like the optical and the near infrared, we're actually seeing tiny dust grains that are about a micron in size that are actually scattering light from the star. And as we move to longer wavelengths, as we go into the infrared, the millimeter, and the radio, we're actually seeing this thermal emission from things that are like millimeter and centimeter size, you know, pebbles in the disks. So these are 4 images of the exact same debris disk. This is AUMIC. It's one of only a few debris disks known around an M-type star. And the top image is showing this near IR view from sphere. There's actually these waves we can see rippling outwards in the plane of the disk. And the bottom 3 panels are all longer wavelength views. So we're seeing 70 microns from Herschel, a millimeter from ALMA, and a centimeter from the Very Large Array. And so now we've taken these infrared excess sources, right, and we can now resolve them both spatially and spectrally. So we can actually look at structure in these disks and structure as a function of wavelength and grain size. So that gives us a completely new view of planet formation. And kind of one of the workhorse instruments that's really completely changed this field is ALMA. So ALMA is the Atacama Large Millimeter submillimeter array, right, which is this array of 66 radio antennas that's built down in the Atacama Desert in Chile. It's at 17,000 feet of elevation. And these antennas are reconfigurable. They can be spread out across the desert to span up to 16 kilometers, which gives you a resolution about 1/100th of an arc second. So we can actually look at nearby planet forming systems and actually resolve them down to the AU scale and really look at very detailed structure. And so this is a gallery of debris disks from kind of the best images we were able to take before we had ALMA. And some of them look like disks. A lot of them look like blobs. We're not seeing a whole lot of structure. And these are the exact same disks now imaged with ALMA. So we're really revealing this whole gallery of structure. We see multiple rings, we see asymmetries, we see potential resonances, warps, all sorts of things going on in these disks. And so this has really opened up this kind of space where we can look at these systems, see them in this level of detail, and then actually model them and try and consider the complicated dynamics of how stars like planets and disks might interact. Okay, so that's the background on planet formation. Now I'm interested in how planetary systems form and then also whether they might be habitable or not, right? So what do we mean by habitable? So astronomers like to have this very simple definition of habitable, right? So oftentimes we'll say, you know, we're thinking about a habitable zone, which is basically saying, if I take an Earth-like planet that's Earth-sized, Earth composition, Earth atmosphere, where can I put it relative to its star, where that temperature on that planet is going to be such that I can have liquid water. And so if you move the planet too close to the star, it gets too hot, all of your water is going to evaporate. If you move your planet too far away, it gets too cold, all the water freezes. This makes a very simple definition of what we mean by habitability. We're just looking for liquid water on planets. But that's pretty simple. And in reality, there's a lot of other factors that might influence a planet's habitability, right? So I put just a few of them on this slide, right? We still care about distance from the star because at least life on Earth is water-based. But we might also care about the star's activity, right? Is it sending charged particles out to hit this planet? You might care how large the planet is. Is it large enough to have a molten core so that it could maintain a magnetic field, which might protect its atmosphere, right? What is its atmospheric composition? So clearly, when we think about habitability in this sort of simple, like, is it in this Goldilocks zone? We're missing a lot of complexity here. And so what I wanted to kind of talk about in the bulk of my talk today is sort of two different ways of looking at habitability. One is trying to consider the role of planetary architectures. So our solar system has this nice architecture. We have 4 inner rocky planets and 4 outer gas giant planets. And maybe that architecture of our planetary system is important when we think about having life here on Earth. And then stellar activity. So the role that the central star plays in terms of actually processing the atmospheres of planets that surround it. Okay, so let's start with the first one, right? Which is the simple question of, do other planetary systems have outer giant planets, right? Do other planetary systems have this kind of architecture where we have outer giants? From an observational exoplanet statistics standpoint, we don't entirely know. So this is a plot that you see pretty frequently in exoplanet work, which shows mass of planets as a function of period, right? So this is semi-major axis, distance of the planet from the star. And color coded here are all the different planets that we've discovered and the different discovery methods we've used to discover them, right? So there's a lot of planets on this part of the diagram, right? Because things like transits and radial velocities are really good at finding planets that are very close to the star, because when we look for transits or radial velocities, we are trying to see something happen a bunch of times, right? You want to see a planet transit multiple times to say, yes, that's definitely a planet. So you're sort of biased towards looking to things on short orbits that are fast, so you can see multiple transit events. And the same kind of thing with radial velocities, where you're actually trying to see this tug or wobble of a star getting pulled by a planet. That also biases you to seeing large things, right? A lot of the RV planets are these very big planets where we're actually, the larger a planet is, the larger the gravitational tug on the star is. And you might notice that these are our solar system planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Earth. And we don't really have a lot of exoplanets on this plot that overlap with things like, say, Saturn and Uranus, right? We don't actually know whether other planetary systems have these sorts of planets, right? This side of the plot is kind of empty. So I'd like to argue is that we can actually use disks as a way to try and answer that question. By saying, if I have something like a Uranus or a Neptune and it's sitting inside of this disk of material, it should be gravitationally sculpting that disk. And I can look for structure in these disks, and if I see it, infer the presence and properties of a planet that might be shaping it. So to motivate that that's not crazy, right? Here's 2 examples. This is the Beta Pictoris system, which is a well-known debris disk. And it has a directly imaged planet, Beta Pictoris b. There's actually a second planet in this system that's been discovered now. And this planet is on a slightly inclined orbit relative to the plane of the disk. And so it's actually warping the inner part of the disk. So the inclination of this planet is actually pulling the disk out of being in a perfectly straight line. And this is actually our own solar system, right? We have the Kuiper belt, which is a debris disk. It's the remnant planetesimals left over from the formation of our own solar system. And if we plot the Kuiper belt objects here, this is eccentricity as a function of some major axis. There's this clustering of what we call the classical Kuiper belt, which are nicely confined between the 3-2 and the 2-1 orbital resonances with Neptune. And the picture there is that Neptune, kind of early in the history of the solar system, actually moved outwards. It swept all of the remnant planetesimals up into this confined belt. So the movement of Neptune early on kind of created this confined population of Kuiper belt objects that we see today. So the hope would be that we can go out and look for structures like these in other disks and then model them and say something about the planets that might have caused the structures to form. So let's talk through a few interesting systems where we can try and do that. So this is Fomalhaut. Fomalhaut is a very famous debris disk. It was first imaged with Hubble, which shows this beautiful ring of emission. Always kind of looks a little like the Eye of Sauron. And Fomalhaut is an A-type star that's kind of roughly 440 million years old. It's right about the age where our solar system might have gone through this period of heavy bombardment where there was a lot of impactors happening on the inner terrestrial planets. So this is Fomalhaut. There's also a tentative directly imaged planet, or there was, Fomalhaut B, which is shown here, but was then shown to be on this orbit that was crossing the belt. And now there's some debate that it might actually just be a dust cloud, like a temporary collision that's dissipated over time. So let's, ignore Fomalhaut B for a second. What we did was try and make a map of the Fomalhaut debris disk with ALMA. And so overlaid now on this is the ALMA image of this disk. And one of the first things you might notice looking at this is that we detect the star, and the star is not actually sitting at the center of this disk. So there's a noticeable offset. The blue X is where the center of the disk is. If I just picked the center of this ring and I plopped an X down, and this is the offset we see to the star. And so that means that this disk is actually eccentric, and it has a significant enough eccentricity that we can actually see this offset visibly in the ALMA image of the system. So what do we do with that, right? That's a beautiful image. That's exciting. How do we actually get useful information out of that? And so the way that we approach this is to actually go back to the original raw data from the telescope, which is what we call the visibilities. So radio interferometers sample the Fourier plane instead of sampling the image plane like an optical telescope does. And to get that ALMA image, I have to take those visibilities, the Fourier plane, and do an inverse Fourier transform and get an image back at the end. But we can skip that process because that's inherently nonlinear, because we have to account for the fact that my radio antennas are sparsely sampled, right? So I'm not getting all the information in Fourier space. And so I'm doing this nonlinear deconvolution. So I lose a lot of my ability to constrain the uncertainties of the variables. So instead, we model the visibilities directly from the telescope. And essentially, we create a modeling package where we make brightness images, and then we sample them and take them into the Fourier plane, and then model directly to the raw visibilities from the telescope. So we fit that within an MCMC framework. And in order to model a disk like Fomalhaut, which is eccentric, essentially we run orbits for about 10 to the 7 particles in a disk. And then we bin those orbits onto a histogram, a 2D histogram, where the binning is basically the pixel size of my image. And then we assume a temperature profile and calculate a flux in all of those pixels. And then we can account for any additional things. So viewing geometry of the disk, what we call the inclination of the position angle, which is how we're viewing that disk on the sky. We can account for brightness from the star and offset, and add in extra parameters. And we fit this all within an MCMC framework. And what that allows us to do is create models of this disk. So this is showing a data on the left of this model, right, at full resolution. The model then imaged like our data, and the resulting residuals, where we are pretty clean in this case, right, which means our model is a good representation of the data. And these are the kind of parameters we can pull out. So we can fit for a flux for the actual disk, a flux for the star, a radius, a radial location of the disk, a width of the disk, these inclination and position angle, which are the viewing geometry, 2 different eccentricities. That EF is the forced eccentricity, which is sort of the global eccentricity of the disk. And EP is the proper eccentricity, which tells you the scatter of the individual eccentricities of each of the bodies in the disk. And then the argument of pericenter. So we can constrain all these parameters and get pretty good constraints on their uncertainties as well. And what was especially interesting about this system is, we fit it with an eccentricity, right? It has an eccentricity of 0.12. And that actually produces an effect that we predicted theoretically, but had never observed until now, which is what's called apocenter glow. So if you look at these 2 images here, this is the Herschel image of the disk on the left. The disk is actually brighter here at pericenter, where it's closer to the star. And on the right, the disk is actually brighter at apocenter, farthest away from the star. It's a little hard to see in the ALMA image. So this is a cut across the ALMA image taken to apocenter in blue and pericenter in purple. And so you can see this noticeable brightness difference between these 2 sides of the disk. So what is that from? Essentially, in the infrared, we're more sensitive to the temperature of the material because it's actually optically thick. So grains that are closer to the star glow more brightly because they're getting heated up more. As we move to the millimeter, we become optically thin. And so we're actually seeing all of the material, and we're more sensitive to surface density. And so things on Keplerian orbits move more slowly at apocenter, which means that you actually predict theoretically that there should be a buildup of material on the apocenter side of the disk. And this is what we see in the ALMA images. What's extra exciting, right, is that we can say, okay, so the disk is eccentric, maybe it's getting sculpted by a planet. And in the case that a disk is getting sculpted by a planet, you'd actually expect the orbits to be what we call apsidally aligned. which means they nest inside of each other, right? So instead of having orbits kind of randomly oriented all over the place, I have orbits that are kind of looping nicely within each other. And that predicts that the width of the disk should actually vary as a function of azimuthal angle. It shouldn't be constant all the way around the ring. And so these are two new images that we've taken with ALMA at very high resolution. So high enough resolution that we can now resolve the disk azimuthally. And they're flashing between apocenter and pericenter. And you can actually see this difference in the width and the profile, the surface tension profile of the disk as you move between apocenter and pericenter. And so we can use this now to place really good constraints on the properties of any possible planet that would be sculpting this system. And global hot isn't the only one where we see this. This is a new disk called HD 53143, which is a bit older. It's about 1 billion years old. And again, this disk looks very eccentric in the ALMA images. So we see the star noticeably offset from the centroid here, right? This is the same data model residual image. And we see this brightening in apocenter. The system seems to be a little bit more complicated because you'll notice that the residuals don't look so clean here, right? There's actually quite a bit of emission. These are 3 sigma contours sitting in the inner parts of the ring, inside of the main belt. So we're not entirely sure what that's from yet, but it might be that there's some kind of material on the inner part of this disk, or maybe material that's coming from the disk and falling into the star, which we're seeing, and we're missing with our simple kind of ring model that we've been using so far. Okay, so that's eccentric disks, but obviously disks could look different, right? They don't all have to be eccentric. So this is a system called HD 15115. This disk, again, in the Hubble image here, right, small dust grains, scattered light, is about 2 times more extended on this side than it is on this side, right? It looks kind of like a needle. The disk is not symmetric on the 2 sides. And initially, this was explained as actually being an interaction with the interstellar medium, where the disk is basically plowing into a dense clump of interstellar gas, and that's causing a ram pressure stripping that's pulling dust grains off to one side of the disk. So we imaged this with ALMA, right, to try and trace these larger grains to see where the planetesimals were in the belt. And so now I've overlaid the ALMA image as contours here on the Hubble image, and then the ALMA image by itself is here on the right. It doesn't look the same, right? We actually see no indication of this asymmetry. And instead, the disk actually looks like it has 2 rings in it. So it has a gap carved out of it. Now I realize that not everybody looks at images of disks all the time. So this is a primer on what it means to look at an edge-on disk in terms of donuts. So yes, right, you can think of your disk as like a ring, it's a donut. If I have a donut and I'm viewing it face on, what we call an inclination of 0 degrees, then I can pick any line of sight through this donut or disk, and I'm going to see the same amount of donut, right? It's going to be an even amount of material all the way around. But if I tilt my donut and I view it edge on, right, like this glazed donut here on the right, now, if I look through the side of the donut, right, I'm seeing donut all the way through. But if I pick on a side that goes to the middle, there's a hole. So I actually see donut, hole, donut. So you'd predict that you should see more material on the edges now that I've inclined my system. It's what we call an onsci, right? I mean, in Latin, that's like jug handles. You see this like higher amount of emission on the sides because you're not looking through the hole. So we go back to this image, right? The center blob is the star, and then you see 2 blobs on either side of the disk. So this is completely edge on, and so those blobs are the 2 onsci of an inner and an outer ring. So again, we can do the same kind of modeling exercise. And what's interesting in this case is, I have a clear gap that's been carved out of this disk, right? It has 1 ring and then an empty gap and another ring. And so a tempting thing is say, like, maybe I'm throwing a planet into that gap. And so I can actually use the properties from ALMA, the location, the radial location of that gap, the width of the gap, and then the depth of the gap, how carved out of it, like how depleted in material is it. And I can use that to basically directly place a constraint on the mass of a planet that could open that gap dynamically. And if I do that, I infer that there's about a 0.16 Jupiter mass planet sitting in the gap of this disk. And then on the bottom, these are dynamical simulations run through code called Rebound, which is an n-body Python code. And I can take the properties of my ALMA disk, put a 0.16 Jupiter mass planet into it, run it for 1 million years and see what happens, right? And you can see that actually in this case, the planet nicely opens up a gap at about 60 AU with the appropriate width in 1 million years timescale. Things change a little bit if I start increasing the eccentricity of that disk, of that planet, right? So if I make a more eccentric planet, the planet can actually open a wider gap at a lower mass. So there's some slough there in terms of how eccentric the planet's orbit is, in terms of what mass is constrained. So if we had higher resolution observations, we could probably say more about the mass of the planet. But we can infer that there might be a planet in the system. And if I do that, right, I can come back to this plot. So this is again showing mass as a function of semi-major axis now. Here's all of our planets that we know from RV and transits. And all of these colored symbols are now the planets that we infer by looking at these gap structures in disks, right? Which is nice because they're actually starting to populate the part of this diagram where our ice giant planets are, right? So these are Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And what I'm getting out of these systems is a whole population of planets that looks like they could be Neptune analogs in other planetary systems. There's an interesting catch here, which I'll note, is that in the earlier systems, these protoplanetary disks, it kind of looks like every time you look at a disk, it's got tons of gaps in it, right? There's just gaps everywhere. And if we look at the more evolved systems, these debris disks, so far we only have 3 of them that we see gaps in. So it raises kind of an interesting question in terms of teasing out which of these gaps really are planets and which of them maybe are something else that we're not accounting for, right? If they're really planets carving out all these gaps, I would probably predict that they should maintain those structures for longer time periods, and I should see lots of gaps in these more evolved debris disks. I don't. So is that telling me something about the evolution of these systems? Maybe some of these gaps are produced by things that aren't planets. Maybe it's an observational bias. You know, debris disks have a lower amount of material in them. I'm just missing the gaps so far, and I just haven't gotten good enough observation scale to tell. Okay. In order to really do better than that, right, we need to be a little less hand-wavy. And I think the key to doing that is to sort of move in this direction of trying to look at systems where we do know we have planets and disks together, so that we can sort of vet this kind of technique of planet hunting, right? And so this is HR 8799. It's very famous because it has 4 directly imaged planets in it, right? So these are planets that we're not seeing through an indirect effect like a transit or radial velocity. We're actually taking a picture of the planet itself. So there's 4 planets orbiting the star, right? And they're actually sitting in this giant disk of material. And so if we say this outer planet, planet B, is actually responsible for carving out this disk, then I can do the same thing like I just did, right? I can assume that that planet is, you know, gravitationally sculpting the disk. I can use the radial location and edge shape of that disk to place a constraint on the mass of the planet. And if I do that, I get what looks like this, right? This is you know, pulling out of that MCMC, you know, one of the slices of that histogram. This is a histogram of then, you know, the probability of different planet masses. And I get that the mass of the planet should be somewhere around 5 to 6 Jupiter masses, which nicely agrees with what we infer by just looking at evolutionary models for these planets, right? Because we can also, you know, model planets dim as they form over time. They have initial heat of formation and then they fade. And so by imaging these planets and plotting them on evolutionary tracks, I can predict the mass of the planet given how bright it is now and the age of the system. And that actually agrees very well with what we get from assuming the planet is sculpting that disk through the ALMA measurement. So in this case, it kind of works, right? And I think if we use more of these sorts of test cases, we can further vet this idea that we can see structure in disks and use it to place constraints on planets. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of a hard turn and talk about some other aspects of habitability that my group has been doing a lot of work on. And this is considering what role stars play sitting in the middle of these planetary systems. So why do we care about stars? The answer is that stars are active. Even our own sun is active. And so stars produce these flares, right? Essentially, the star has a magnetic field lines that thread through the photosphere of the star. That's convecting, right? And so the foot points where these magnetic field lines intersect the photosphere of the star move as the star convects. And as a result, it twists the magnetic field lines up. And eventually you build up so much magnetic tension that the field lines snap and they reconnect in a more stable configuration. And that snapping releases a huge amount of electromagnetic radiation. They also produce coronal mass ejections, right? So our sun, very powerful flares in the sun are also accompanied by what we call a CME, which is a release of charged particles, you know, actual material from the star getting flung out into space. And when those stream out, they intersect, you know, our Earth and our magnetic field, and they make it in through the poles of the planet. And they can do things like dissociate molecules in the atmosphere, things like ozone and water. When we see beautiful auroral emission in our atmosphere, it's coming from this sort of charged high energy radiation hitting our Earth's atmosphere, breaking things apart, which is maybe bad for a habitability standpoint, but beautiful from an auroral standpoint, right? And on Earth, we have a nice strong magnetic field. So this isn't a hugely damaging situation. Our sun is also not a particularly active star. But a lot of stars that we look around and know that there's exoplanets, and when we talk about exoplanets being in that habitable zone, are much more active than our sun. And so, if we're going to think about habitability on these planets, we need to think about stars' activity and what that might do to these planets. So the key here is that when this happens, the stars emit radiation across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And different wavelengths of light are actually picking up different physical processes happening during one of these flaring events. So this is kind of a cartoon picture here, right? Showing these magnetic field lines twisting up and reconnecting, right? They're breaking at this point. And we can trace roughly different types of emission to different parts of this, right? So things like optical light are actually coming from deeper down in the stellar atmosphere. We're seeing these foot points where the magnetic field actually intersects the surface of the star. And so this is getting heated up and glowing like a really hot black body. Things like radio emission are actually coming from higher up in the loop. We think we're seeing things like synchrotron radiation where particles are actually getting excited and looping around these magnetic field lines. So if we look at different wavelengths of light, we're actually going to trace different parts of this flare physics. And so we really want to understand what's happening physically in a star when it releases one of these events. We need to look in this multi-wavelength picture. And this is kind of a nice example from our sun. This is not a huge wavelength range. This is only 131 to 1600 angstroms. But if you look at this, right, this is a flaring event, a CME. It's completely different in different wavelengths, right? Some of these look like it's very extended. Some of these are nice close-in loop structures. So even over this very short wavelength range, we're tracing very different parts of this event on our own sun. So I got interested in stellar activity through a little bit of a circuitous path in that, I work on circumstellar disks, and circumstellar disks surround stars, and the stars are doing interesting things, which we had typically ignored. So Proxima Centauri is the closest M-type star to us. It's at, a little over a parsec away. And it hosts 2 planets, one of which is in the habitable zone of the star. So Proxima Cent B is a roughly Earth mass planet. This is a much smaller, cooler star. So habitable zone means it's at 0.05 AU instead of 1 AU, like around our sun. The other planet is a bit more massive and further away. And a group looked at this system with ALMA to try and look for dust emission from the system. Trying to draw an analogy to our own solar system, since we have a star and multiple planets and a dust disk surrounding us, right? They have an asteroid in the Kuiper Belt. And if we saw that something like that in Proxima, that would be really interesting. We have a system where we have a possibly habitable planet, we have multiple dust rings, we have a star. So they imaged this with ALMA, and they made a claim that there's actually a system of dust surrounding the star, 2 like a colder, some belts close in, and 1 very far away. Right, so 2 sort of inner terrestrial type asteroid belt analogs, and 1 kind of Kuiper Belt analog. Okay, that seems great. So I grabbed this data from the ALMA archive and I reanalyzed it because I just kind of wanted to take a peek. And what I did differently was that I split the observations up. So the original team had imaged the star 13 times. Each of those is about an hour in length. And then, as we often do in radio astronomy and disks, we just kind of averaged all that data together and made 1 very deep, low noise image. So that's what's on the left panel here. It is all 13 hours averaged together. And you can see that this is the stellar location. There's something detected there. Has a flux of about 340 microjanskis. The star should be about 70 microjanskis. So this is in excess of the star. So it looks like it might be some kind of infrared excess source, right? Where this dust is surrounding the star, it's getting heated up and it's glowing in these longer millimeter wavelengths, and we're seeing kind of an unresolved disk. Problem is, if you look at just the first 12 observations, you get this middle panel here. This looks very different, right? There's nothing detected at the center of the image. There's nothing at the position of the star. If you image just the last observation, you get the image on the right. And now there's still something at the star, but it's bright. It's very bright, right? It has a flux of about a millijansky. We can actually do better. So ALMA actually takes data in about a 1-second integration timescale. And if we do that, and we look back at the original integrations of the telescope, we get this, which is that there's actually nothing detected in this last observation for a majority of it, except for about 2 minutes, where the star goes through this rapid oscillation, and then this big burst where it brightens by up to 100 millijansky, and then fades away to nothing. And so this is actually a flare, right? And we hadn't really thought about it before because we've never detected flaring emission from stars in the millimeter. So it didn't occur to anybody to try and look at this data with ALMA in a time-resolved way. So it's bad news for the dust disk because there's clearly no need to have a disk at 1 AU if the emission is transitory and only there for 2 minutes, because that's not a dust disk. But it was exciting from a stellar flaring perspective because it's the first time we'd actually seen emission in these wavelengths from a flaring star. Okay, so what was needed then was to try and understand how that emission correlates, right? Because we now saw millimeter emission and we knew stars flared at other wavelengths, but we didn't know how the millimeter emission sort of fit into the larger picture. And so I constructed a multi-wavelength observing campaign where we went back with ALMA and then added a whole suite of other telescopes to sort of do a definitive multi-wavelength campaign to try and understand the flaring rates and the flaring physics. So we looked at Proxima again. We spent about 40 hours between April and July of 2019, and this was ALMA observations coupled with several ground-based optical telescopes. So we have DuPont doing spectroscopy, the Everyscope and Las Campanas doing optical photometry. We timed this to coincide with TESS observations when TESS was observing Proxima. And then we added Hubble to do the ultraviolet, Swift to do ultraviolet X-rays, and Chandra to do X-rays as well. So really spanning everything from the radio to the X-ray wavelengths. I put this up just to show that this is hard to do, right? There's a reason that people aren't always trying to coordinate 8 different observatories at the same time, because stuff happens. So this is a giant spreadsheet that shows all the ground-based telescopes here on the left and all the space-based telescope on the right. And these are all the different days that we were trying to do observations. Anything in red was either not scheduled, right? Because you can't just schedule telescopes willy-nilly. And some of them are issues because stuff happens when you try and coordinate telescopes, right? So ALMA had a snowstorm, had a power outage. This was back in a period when Hubble was having an issue with its gyros. So it was like failing to point some nights. So this is, a fun logistical nightmare. But in good news, we got a lot of multi-wavelength data where we get to see this very beautiful like multi-wavelength correlation across many different facilities. So hard to do, but possible. And we published the first paper from this back at the end of the spring this year. So we detected the largest flare we've ever seen from Proxima Centauri with Hubble and with ALMA. And so this is kind of a complicated multi-panel figure, so I'll walk you through it. This left upper panel is showing median normalized flux. So this is flux normalized to the quiescent level of the star, just versus time on the bottom. And then the time on the upper axis, which is getting covered up by the zoom window, is actually time relative to the peak of the flare. And it's stepping in wavelengths. So the top is ALMA in the red, and then going to TESS, DuPont, H alpha, and helium-1. So these are 2 kind of well-known tracers of flare physics. Hubble in the continuum emission in the dark color, and then silicon 4 line in the sort of lighter purple color. The right is a zoom in of just the ALMA data and the Hubble data. And the bottom is actually ASCAP data. So we tried to coordinate with some Australian telescopes as well, which is hard because Australia is in a very different time zone than Chile. But we did manage to get some simultaneous cover. And so this is very long wavelength I and V polarization with ASCAP. So what was surprising is that the millimeter data and the Hubble data trace each other almost exactly. The flare has the exact same profile and the exact same rise time in Hubble and ALMA, which we weren't necessarily expecting that to be so close. In the Hubble data, the star brightens by a factor of almost 15,000. So that's 15,000 times the quiescent level. And in ALMA, it's a factor of 1,000, a little bit over 1,000 increasing. The optical data seems to be decoupled. So you can actually see that there's this clear offset in the optical emission where we see a delay between when we see this sort of flare in the millimeter and the UV, and then there's a gap, and then we see a flare in the optical data. So the optical data is clearly tracing something different, right? Physically, it's not tracing the exact same emission mechanism. So I think this is really intriguing because right now, the sort of state of the art from like a habitability atmospheric processing plane is to think about ultraviolet emission, right? Because it's the UV that has high enough energy to actually dissociate molecules in atmospheres. And so we want to get UV observations of everything, right? To try and understand what's happening to the atmospheres. But Hubble is kind of the only thing we can use in the ultraviolet. It's really hard to get Hubble time. Hubble's having some issues. So it'd be nice if there was some other way to constrain this, right? And so if we can prove really that this correlation holds, we could actually use millimeter and radio observations to then infer UV fluxes for stars. And we could say a whole lot more about the sort of high energy radiation environments of these different planets. So a few more ways of looking at this. This is kind of looking again at the optical data. These are what we call flare frequency distributions, which is basically number of flares as a function of energy and amplitude on the x-axis. And this is plotting all flares that have been seen with TESS and this ground-based survey called the Every Scope. And the green line is indicating where this flare is that we observed that's enormous with Hubble and ALMA. But in the optical, it's really tiny. So bigger flares are over here on the right. This flare is tiny. About 75% of flares that we see with TESS are brighter than this flare is in the optical. And we would predict from these statistics that we'd see a flare of this energy in the optical basically every single day. So again, emphasizing this kind of difference between what we're seeing in the UV and the millimeter, which is that this is an extreme event, and the optical, where this doesn't seem to be that exciting at all, right? So, I think there's a lot we have been missing by not doing this sort of multi-wavelength work, because we're, making correlations we don't actually have the data to back up. The other nice thing is that with ALMA, we actually get more information than just flux. So ALMA observes at what we call a bandwidth, right? It has a range of frequencies that we observe in one observation. So we can calculate what's called a spectral index, which is how the flux changes as a function of that bandwidth, a function of frequency, which is what we call alpha here. And ALMA observes in the XX and YY polarizations for free. And so we can use that to try and rederive a limit on the linear polarization of the light. So this is showing two flares we'd seen previously with ALMA. And now this is our flare from May 1st. And they're starting to look like a cohesive population. If we look at the spectral index in all of these, the spectral index starts off as like a Rayleigh-Jeans normal black body spectrum, and then dips to these very negative spectral indices and then recovers as the flare happens. And there's evidence that there's this linear polarization signal. So we're actually seeing some evidence of polarization in the light. So we think that this is telling us something about the emission mechanism in the millimeter wavelengths, where we might actually be seeing some kind of optically thin tail of synchrotron or gyrosynchrotron emission, where we're seeing this polarization because we're actually seeing the light getting accelerated, these electrons getting accelerated. And so that the millimeter and radio might be more directly tracing these sort of charged particles that we'd like to know what's happening with them if they're going to impact atmospheres. Okay, coming back to the dust disk for a second, right? So, the flaring emission ruled out those inner dust disks, but it didn't really rule out this 30 AU population of dust. So by staring at Proxima for 40 hours with ALMA to look for flares, we actually also created an incredibly deep image of the system. So Jay, one of my grad students, is working on this right now. So this is showing a Hubble image in the background, and it's overlaying the old ALMA data from 2017 on the left and the new ALMA data in 2019 on the right. Now, if you just look at the center, right, Proxima is so close to us that it has a huge proper motion in the sky. So between 2017 and 2019, Proxima's moved a lot. So we can actually see, 2017, the Hubble from 2018, the ALMA from 2019, right? The star has scooted across this image. So this outer dust disk was claimed by sort of saying these blobs out here are maybe over-resolving a surrounding disk. We've got too high a resolution, so we're seeing it as a sort of patchy emission, but actually we can put our averages together and say it's a dust disk. And if it really was, it should have moved with the star, which it has not. The blobs are all actually in the exact same place. And so Proxima is tricky because it's sitting in the galactic plane. So there's a lot of background emission. And so it seems pretty clear by doing this analysis, right, that actually this isn't a dust disk either. We're actually seeing a bunch of background sources. And there's enough kind of already taken data that Jay's basically been going back and reconstructing the spectral energy distribution of all these sources, because we can look in the infrared, we can look with Hubble, we can look with Gaia, and you can trace and identify many of these as either stars or background galaxies that are sitting behind Proxima and happen to emit in the millimeter, but are not actually a disk associated with the star. So bad news for all dust surrounding Proxima. From a stellar perspective, that's only one flare, and we stared for 40 hours. So there's a huge amount of data remaining to look through. So this is another flare we detected on a different day, showing the same very strong correlation between the ALMA and Hubble data. And this flare isn't even seen at all in the test data. So we see basically no optical signature from it. And on the right, this is sort of adding up all the flares we detected from ALMA and trying to make one of these flare frequency distributions per millimeter, which again, we haven't been able to do because we haven't had the data to do it. And so we detect, a huge number of flares, many, many small flares, right? And a few larger flares. But, essentially even in the ALMA data, this star is flaring every hour, every couple hours. We see a large flare basically every day. And it's not just M dwarfs that flare in the millimeter. So this is a project that one of my other grad students is working on. We went back in the ALMA archive because ALMA has been observing for a decade now. And we can go and look at all of these stars that have disks around them that we might be interested in imaging disks and look at the stars instead. So Epsilon Eridani is a well-known star that has a kind of giant planet and a beautiful debris disk surrounding it. And so we pulled all the observations from the ALMA archive and went through them in this time resolved way, imaging, fitting models to every single integration to create light curves. And we found 3 different flares. So these are the 3 flares. And this is now making a table of kind of all the flares we've detected with ALMA so far. We've seen 2 from AU-NIC, also in the ALMA archive. Here's all the Proxima flares, and now these 3 from Epsilon Eridani. And what's extra intriguing about these is that the spectral indices for these flares seem to be a little bit different, right? So I showed you all these images with these nice negative spectral indices. Some of these are actually very steeply positive. So that's interesting, right? They don't seem to agree. And we have observed our sun several times in the millimeter, and solar flares actually seem to show these very steeply positive spectral indices. They're the opposite of what we're seeing with ALMA for the M dwarfs. And Epsilon Eridani is a K dwarf star, and it's intriguing that it has kind of similar spectral indices to our sun, which are different than the spectral indices that we see from M dwarfs. So obviously, playing around with small number statistics here, right? I have 10 flares that I'm showing you, but I think we're starting to get to the point where we've built up enough of a sample that we can actually start to draw some correlations and say something interesting. Okay. And again, this is HD 53143, which I showed you earlier because it has a beautiful eccentric disk around it, but the star is also misbehaving in the system as well. We had 11 observations of the star to get this beautiful image of the disk. And if you look at just the star, the light curve from ALMA is this black line, so it changes by quite a bit during its during the ALMA observations. And what's nice conveniently about this is that we just happen to be observing with ALMA at the same time as TESS was observing. And so we can actually overlay the ALMA data on top of the TESS data and try and look for any correlations between the optical and the millimeter. So, sometimes it works out nicely that you can do this kind of multi-wavelength work for free without even trying to coordinate the 8 different telescopes all together with the snowstorms and the gyro issues at the same time. Okay. So I wanted to come back to this, right, and say, we talked about 2 things, right? And that's exciting, but clearly there's a lot of other pieces here. So where are things getting interesting in the future? So one thing I think is going to be really fun to think about is this idea of volatile abundance and composition of disks. So we can detect gas in these systems. So this is another debris disk where we actually detect a significant amount of carbon monoxide emission. So the left is showing the dust as kind of the color in the background, and then the contours are showing the gas emission. So we detect a significant amount of gas, and it seems to be co-located with the dust. So the idea is that this is actually outgassing, right? Comets are colliding and they're grinding and they're outgassing CO. And so we see the dust and the gas in the same place because the dust is basically being produced in the same collisions that are producing the gas. This is showing actual rotation because we can measure the rotation of the gas, right? So it's showing the colored is the rotation, the velocity of the gas, and then the contours are just showing the bulk amount of gas. So there's now a fair number of systems that we've made these gas detections in, and we can start to think some about, what is the volatile composition that went into the plants in the first place. I'll note another observational bias here. This is a nice figure from a review article from 2018 and showing where we've actually detected this gas, right? And Orange are the actual detections. So almost all of the detections of gas we've made in these disks so far come from very young stars and very early spectral types, right? So these are A and B stars, FGK stars, and M stars. We know almost nothing about disks around M stars, but almost all of these gas detections are coming from sort of things that are less than 50 million years old and around A-type stars. And it's interesting to think about whether that's an observational bias or not, right? Either that's telling us something different about these A-type star debris disks and planet formation in these systems, or we just haven't detected it so far. We can get more information by thinking about dust composition as well, right? So we can actually use multi-wavelength observations, say between ALMA and the VLA, to measure size distributions of dust grains and disks. And that tells us something about the collisions that are happening, because depending upon how destructive the collisions are, I might expect to see more smaller grains or fewer smaller grains. And so by measuring that grain size distribution, I'm saying something about the properties of those bodies. And we can do this through several different means. We actually see that a lot of these disks have very similar grain size distributions, but there are some hints of trends, right? Where it might be that some of these earlier type stars, A-type stars, have more smaller grains in the system. Maybe that tells us that these disks have more collisions happening that are grinding and creating all these tiny dust grains. Maybe that's because they're getting stirred up by planets. And this also, I think, telling us something interesting about the composition of the grains, because these are fit best with models that have the grains be very porous. So instead of thinking of these as like hard rocks or pebbles hitting together, you're sort of thinking more that these are like fluffy bodies, conglomerates that are colliding and are maybe not as destructive when they collide. Okay. And I say all of this to say that we're getting more observational facilities in the future that are going to enable us to do more of this work. So this is kind of a schematic, a cartoon of what's going on in these disks, right? And it's complicated. There's all sorts of gas and grain dynamics and different populations and different temperatures. But using different observational facilities, we can start to probe different regions of planetary systems. So ALMA is really great at telling us things about molecular gas sitting in the cold outer portions of disks. Something like James Webb is going to be really good at looking at sort of interterrestrial regions, hotter populations of dust, looking at silicon emission, hotter atomic gas as opposed to molecular gas. And so I think that we're sort of moving to this ability to actually trace different parts of planetary systems and really start to consider, volatile compositions. Okay, so all of that is to say that I think that doing this kind of work and asking these questions is fundamentally an interdisciplinary topic, right? We have to think about systems as a whole that are interconnected, because I can't tell you that much about a planet if I just only look at the planet. I can tell you a lot more if I think about everything that's happening around it, right? What did it form out of? How is it getting processed by something sitting in the middle of the system? And I'll highlight kind of two things that I think are exciting that I'm working on now. One is a project that is, a NASA ICAR, Interdisciplinary Consortium for Astrobiology Research Project. So I'm working with Natalie Battaglia at UC Santa Cruz, and then several collaborators at Hawaii and Kansas and NASA Ames. And our hope is to do sort of a real bigger picture analysis of how volatiles come from disks into planets and then outgassed into atmospheres and then processed in those atmospheres. So when we get a JWST observation of an atmosphere, we have some idea of where all that gas came from. And going more into the real biology aspect of this, I'm starting a new project with two collaborators to actually think about what happens when flares impact atmospheres, how that changes the chemistry of those atmospheres, what amount of UV light reaches the surface, and then to actually try this experimentally in a lab. So we're going to try and simulate, M-dwarf exoplanet environments in a laboratory and look for damage that might happen to DNA as a function of UV flux to try and, really get at would Earth-like life survive in these atmospheres, in these planets. And with that, I will leave up some take-home messages, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions, and I'll let you type.
Yeah.
So could you say a little bit more about the timing uncertainties in this big multi-wavelength campaign? You showed some pops in seconds and some pops in fractions of a day. And how they compare to this delay that you found between.
Yep.
It seems significant. Yeah.
Yes.
But
yeah.
It just sounds like a counting thing
Yeah, so if I like. Ooh, I have to go through so many things to go back to that plot. In general, right, so like on that plot, I'm plotting X error bars as well, and the X error bars are actually the integration times. So we're basically treating every point as if it's the center point of the observation, and then the X error bar tells you the integration. And you're right, different observatories have completely different integration times. So with ALMA and Hubble, we're able to push it down to a second. In the optical test is a 2-minute cadence. DuPont, because we're trying to integrate long enough to get spectral, actual like H alpha detections, those are like 10-minute integration times. And so there is some uncertainty there, right? So I can say that it does seem to be significant because at the very least, like there's enough of a delay that the error bars don't overlap, right? So that where the peak is in the optical, you know, there are all the points that would have been there, and there is no evidence of any flux in the ALMA points. So there is some definitive difference there, but the accuracy of what that offset is in terms of seconds or minutes, we don't have because we have different integration times, right? So it would be lovely if we could have infinite integration time with everything, but we can't. I think, you know, TESS is doing a lot shorter integration times now, which is a lot better for stellar flaring stuff. Now TESS is on 20-second cadence. So you can do a lot better than 2 minutes.
Other questions?
I should probably check.
Yeah, I'm checking too.
We have bad sound quality.
I was right.
I am curious about what your thoughts are in terms of the future of exoplanet detection, because you showed that like radio detections of exoplanets can help fill out in terms of like longer periods and things like that. But I'm wondering whether you think that's tenable for discovering a large number of exoplanets.
Yes, good questions. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, the longer we observe for, you know, radial velocities and transits, start to be able to detect things on longer orbital periods. So that's, I mean, like in an ideal world, right, we sort of meet somewhere in the middle, right, where other ways we have of detecting exoplanets start to overlap with this disk population, so that we can also fully confirm that what I'm saying from gaps and disks is real exoplanets. I think the best possibility of that is direct imaging. So right now, direct imaging is detecting a lot of like really big planets, like really far out in systems, right? When I show you HRD 79, those are like out at 100 AU. So they're not actually that comparable to our solar system. But as direct imaging gets better, you know, the hope would be direct imaging starts to push in to the inner parts of solar systems. And then, you know, there is some hope that we could go and directly image the planets in these gaps that we're seeing in disks, right? And that would be like a real definitive test. So, you know, I think to really do that, we're gonna need a LUVOIR or something, which is probably not on the horizon anytime soon. But
I think Elva has a hand raised. Do you think you have to?
oh,
Yes.
There we go.
Yeah. I'm wondering about PAH features. Are those detected in some of these debris disks? And if so, what could they tell you? And how does
Yeah.
that relate to that?
that's a good question. So PAH emission is detected in really young systems, but it hasn't been detected in more evolved systems. So in general, from like debris disks, we pretty much have only detected CO and some like atomic carbon and oxygen lines, but pretty much CO and almost nothing else, which is, you know, probably like a detection limit issue, I think. If these are really comets like our solar system, we should detect other cometary type things like CN and HCN, and people have looked but haven't detected anything so far. Yeah. So for the most part, I think we've only ever seen PAHs from like really, really young, kind of like still embedded in their envelope secretion onto the star type systems, and not from things where you started to like open gaps up from planets into disks.
Thank you.
Maybe one last question? Online or in person? Whoever gets to it first.
Sorry, I don't think I hog your time too much, but I'm curious in looking at like younger systems versus older systems. Like a very common theme in planet formation is like, and evolution is how they migrate. And I'm wondering if you see any like correlations between like younger and older systems in terms of like whether they migrate or don't migrate, or if you're even able to tell that from these observations.
Yeah, so that's an interesting and good question. So my one undergrad is for his senior thesis, doing a project where we're going to try and think about that for hot Jupiters, right? Because there's a question of how you get hot Jupiters really close to their planet. And one possibility is that they're like dynamically scattered in which case you might expect there to be a difference in like the inclination of the stars and the planets and the disks that would be evidence of some kind of like massive kicking, right? Because if everything's nicely aligned, then you're sort of in this like everything's nicely in a plane and things look pretty good, but maybe you could detect this kind of kink, right? Or like this difference where you see the star aligned one way and the disk has been noticeably kicked in the other direction. And that might tell you something about the migration of these. So he's going to use test data to get stellar inclinations, and then we're going to kind of comb the ALMA archive for like, because we can measure the inclinations really well of disks now, and just try and see if there's any evidence that there's any orbital differences. I don't know, maybe. Yeah.
All right. Great, let's thank our speaker one more time. And if you do want to chat a little bit now, I'm just going to go ahead and offer you all for a few minutes.
Yes,
If people do have any last
Turn this off.
questions.
I'll say hi.
Hi.
I'm Stephen White. We used to do centimeter observations, so like centimeter observations of stars.
Okay.
So we did the observations of Proxima.